I'm going to talk mainly or almost entirely about Palladas, the late antique epigrammatist of Alexandria, the best represented author of the Greek anthology. His works have, from the Greek anthology, have recently been supplemented by remains of some 35 further epigrams in the fragmentary papyrus codex from the Beinecke Library at Yale, now published by Kevin Wilkinson. In both these collections, the anthology and also the new codex, there emerges a unique poetic voice, distinctly querulous, world-weary, sardonic, whose speaker, identifying himself repeatedly as a Hellene, that is, as a non-Christian and as a school teacher, confronts a turbulent world in which the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire challenged and overthrew the old Hellenic order. Much work on Palladas over the last half-century has sought to use the epigrams to shed light on the author's historical circumstances. Scholars have thus tried to link particular poems to specific events, creating a kind of Palladan chronology in which the epigrams strung together constitute a virtual life of Palladas. Thus, for instance, Baura in 1959 connects certain epigrams to the anti-pagan reforms of Theodosius I in the 380s and 90s, which in Alexandria, the presumed setting of the poems, led to the notorious Christian attacks on Greek cult, in particular to the seizure of the Serapeum under Bishop Theophilus in 391. Baura traces how Palladas initially reacts with derision at the incursions of Christianity upon Hellenic life in Alexandria, how thereafter his usual irony gives place to amazement and anxiety and a feeling that the whole order of things has been overturned, and how then in a further stage he responds with anger and, quote, suffers from the shock of the Christian reversal of his familiar world, unquote, as Palladas himself puts it at the grim close of a famous epigram, which is number 1 on your handouts: "We Hellenes are men reduced to ashes, holding to our buried hopes in the dead, for everything now has been turned on its head." At such times, according to Baura, it would have been dangerous to continue public instruction in the old literature, which was the stronghold of pagan beliefs. Thus, Palladas gave up his profession, sold his books. The story ends, according to Baura, with a kind of accommodation. Quote, "His new employment coincided with some change in his outlook, and this must be that he came to some sort of terms with Christianity," unquote. Baura's historical biographical narrative, which argues that Palladas lived between about 319 and the 390s, results in a satisfying tale, if ultimately a quite speculative one, leading from crisis to a pleasing resolution in the end. Speculation notwithstanding, the basic impulse to mine the epigrams for historical data continues to the present day. Thus, most recently, Wilkinson has proposed setting Palladas' birth far earlier, around 260, and taking many of those same epigrams that Baura and others had linked to the Christian pagan conflicts of Alexandria in the 380s and 90s, as in fact referring to events 60 years earlier in the reign of Constantine during the 320s and 330s. While Wilkinson does not spin out a thoroughgoing biographical narrative for Palladas, as Baura had, he does use his redating to argue that the poet was present in Constantinople not long after its foundation, and that more of his poems than previously had been imagined refer with topical relevance to monuments in Constantine's new capital. In all, the redating means for Wilkinson, as he puts it, quote, something rather extraordinary. We have managed to recover a contemporary pagan witness to the final period of Constantine's reign. So again, mining the poems for historical insight. While I find Wilkinson's new dating plausible, if still speculative, my concern in this paper is not with tying the epigrams of Palladius to specific historical events, personages, or sites. The poet's references are, for the most part, too vague to allow certainty. My focus instead is on Ecphrasis. In particular, I want to examine how Palladius adapted conventions of Ecphrasis to a new cultural climate, one in which Hellenic religion was under attack by increasingly assertive Christians who desecrated not only Greek cult sites, but also the chief object, or a chief object, of ekphrastic description, images of the gods, wherever they could find them. For this purpose, it makes no great difference to me whether Palladius was referring to events in the 320s and 30s or in the 390s. Ecphrasis, it's worth noting, is not particularly common in Palladius. Descriptions of sites, monuments, or objects, and of the act of viewing and construing them are comparatively rare. Where they do occur, however, Palladius dwells on monuments that have been disfigured or transformed. Their very disfigurement and transformation, a monument's metamorphosis, you could even call it, from one state into another, become his theme. Already Simonides, in PMG 581, had of course pointed out that monuments may suffer change. Their strength is no match for the elements, and mortal hands can shatter stone. But that was merely framed as an eventuality, and the norm was rather to view monuments as emblems of permanence. Palladius, by contrast, contemplates and reflects on the altered monument. This is true not only for epigrams from the anthology, but also for those from the new Papyrus Codex, where, for example, and this is number 2 on your handouts, Palladius may, by means of a haunting image, refer to the destroyed Alexandrian Museum as, quote, an empty tomb of the Muses, kenon muson erion, a cenotaph, in other words, a thriving shrine transformed into a cenotaph. Just how far-reaching were the threats to statues of the old Hellenic gods? A well-known epigram by Palladius offers a trenchant commentary on this question by suggesting that only on Olympus might the gods still be safe from the risk of mutilation, and that their statues were now suffering. And this is number 3 on your handouts. Having turned Christian, those who have their houses on Olympus live there without injury, for no melting pot will place them in the fire so as to make a life-giving coin. This epigram, which is not, I think, ekphrastic, has been misinterpreted since Byzantine times as referring to a group of statues kept safe from damage and reuse by being moved to a safe place. The reference in verse 2, enthade, here, before the viewer's eyes, is that safe place according to the already the Byzantine tradition to which they have been moved. And the lemma to the poem identifies the location as, quote, the house of Marina, who has been variously identified with actual figures of princess and others, although again, without any great certainty. Although the Byzantine lemmata of the anthology have long been held suspect, scholars have followed its lead in understanding the adverb to mean here, enthade, that is, as referring to a place different from the Olympia domata of verse 1. In my opinion, however, the poem comes into sharper focus if we construe enthade as there, in that place, that is, on Olympus. The caustic point of enthade, then, is that even those who live far from the encroachments of Christianity, seemingly secure in that most remote bastion of paganism, Mount Olympus, take the precaution of converting so as to remain safe. Elsewhere, by contrast, statues of the old Hellenic gods remain at risk of degradation, a kind of forced conversion, you could say, by being cast into the melting pot, chone, in verse 3, only to turn up as coinage, the follis, a Roman denomination. Such were the threats to which the statues of the gods were exposed, as Palladas' Ecphrasis on defaced monuments vividly attest. Before turning to these, however, it may be helpful to consider one of the few more conventional ekphrastic poems of Palladas as a baseline, and this is number 4 on your handouts. The epigram in question concerns a statue or perhaps a painting of Eros. It is located in a series from Planudes by poets of various eras on artworks depicting this god. Statues of Eros disarmed and often bound appear in ekphrastic epigrams as early as the 2nd century BC, and our poem falls into that tradition. Eros is naked and therefore is smiling and gentle, not wearing his bow or his blazing dart. Nor is it pointless that he clasps in his hand a dolphin and flower, for with the one he is holding the earth, with the other the sea. The speaker here begins each couplet by stating what he sees and then interpreting the image at hand on that basis. Eros is naked, the speaker declares, and to his mind, the nudity explains the smiling aspect of the god as well as his gentleness. Dia tuto gela, kai melichos estin. If melechia is not an obvious physical trait visible to the eye, the speaker nonetheless justifies his assessment of the god's mildness with the added observation, introduced by the gar clause, ugareke, in verse 2, that Eros lacks his weapons, the deadly bow and arrow. Similarly, at the start of the 2nd couplet, the speaker notes that the god holds a dolphin in one hand, a flower in the other, and that he does not do so pointlessly, udematein, verse 3. This observation is justified yet again by a gar clause, explaining in allegorical terms the idea behind these attributes. His lack of arms notwithstanding, the mighty Eros controls both sea and land. Generally, then, the poem mimics the process of viewing and the concomitant act of interpretation. In portraying the act of seeing an artwork, reflecting on it, and interpreting it, the epigram thus comprises standard elements of ekphrasis. Disfigured statuary, on the other hand, does not conventionally feature in such poetry, yet convention is subject to the pressures of circumstance and thus gives way to change. Palladas doubtless experienced such pressures as witness to a time when statues of the gods were being toppled, mutilated, melted, and reused by Christian zealots. So how did Palladas deal with such disfigurement and reuse of divine statuary in his ekphrastic poems? In answer, let's examine a further epigram on an effigy of Eros, and this is 5a on your handouts. A bronzesmith refashioning Eros made a frying pan, not unreasonably, since that too scorches. Even if we do not take this poem as reflecting specific circumstances at Alexandria in the year 391, it's worth noting the testimony about that year in Socrates' Historia Ecclesiastica, and that's 5b on your handouts, if only as evidence for the kind of treatment statues of the gods were now exposed to. At the solicitation of Theophilus, Bishop of Alexandria, the emperor issued an order at this time for the demolition of the heathen temples in that city. These were therefore razed to the ground, and the images of their gods recast into pots and other convenient utensils for the use of the Alexandrian church, for the emperor had instructed Theophilus to distribute them for relief of the poor. As this passage shows, the statues of the gods were now being transformed into objects totally alien to their natures. Or were they? The epigram of Palladas dwells on precisely this question, which it frames as a kind of riddle, and to which it offers a joking response. Palladas clearly treats his subject here as a variation on ekphrastic norms. He contemplates an object, the teganon, the humble kitchen utensil, the word is at home in comedy, and ponders its significance. Yet in this instance, the implement's meaning is predicated on its prior destruction and transformation out of a bronze eros. It is the altered object, along with the link between its present and past state, that interests the speaker. As commonly in Ecphrasis, his contemplation results in an interpretation. The object's alienation from its former aspect and significance turns out to be only superficial. The smith's recasting was uk alogos. So why is a frying pan like the god of love? That's sort of like the joking riddle. That is the question the speaker seems to ask. In answer, the epigram wittily, perhaps also ruefully, suggests a connection. They both scorch you. Palladas' focus on the metamorphosis of the artwork here is, I believe, deliberately and playfully also evocative of his own creative process. For like the bronzesmith in the epigram, the poet has transformed his source, metalaxas, verse 1, and created out of it something new, epoiese, verse 1, though related. To my knowledge, it has not till now been recognized that Palladas drew for his poem on a famous poem passage from Anacreon, and this is 5c on your handouts. Once more, like a smithy, Eros battered me with his huge axe and doused me in an icy torrent. Eros is himself here envisioned as a brute, irresistible force, like a kalkeus or smithy who beats the speaker yet again into the shape, the desired shape, and then tempers his erotic metal, as it were, with a plunge into ice-cold water. Palladas, like the bronzesmith in his poem, transforms Anacreon's striking image, and he does so by inverting it. The god, this time, is the object of violence, accusative erota in place of Anacreon's eros, reversal of Anacreon's order in subject and object, kalkotypos ton erota, and then meros in Anacreon. And rather than appearing as kalkeus, Eros is now beaten into a new form by a kalkotypos, whose harsh typos doubtless picks up and varies Anacreon's ekopsin. Significantly, Palladas also alters his source by taking what was just a comparison in Anacreon, hos de kalkeus in verse 1, and making it real, a flesh and blood character in his poem, the kalkotypos. Similarly, he takes the sublime, irresistible eros of Anacreon and brings him down to earth, turning him into malleable base matter, bronze, the stuff of gods and frying pans. Thus Palladius brazenly reworks his source and, with a coarse admixture of irony, wit, and rue, even as his Chalcotypos had turned a transcendent deity into a kitchen utensil. There are several other epigrams by Palladius about disfigured and transformed effigies of the gods, but I want to close with one, an Ecphrasis on a bronze statue of Heracles, which is number 6 on your handouts. I marveled at the bronze son of Zeus at the crossroads, formerly an object of prayers, now torn down on the ground. Indignant, I spoke, protector from ills, child of 3 nights, never defeated, are you laid flat in a single day? But at night the god stood beside me and smiling addressed me, God though I am, I have learned to serve the times. As before, we find conventions of ekphrasis. The speaker marvels at an artwork, at Thaumasa, verse 1, and describes his reaction to it, here in the form of a modified dialogue epigram. The addressee, Heracles' reply is delayed, coming that night in a dream. At first, nothing suggests that the statue is not intact. Indeed, the poem's language could be construed as not referring to a statue at all, but to a living, thriving hero, with kalkeon huia, meaning simply strong son of Zeus. But with verse 2, Palladius comes to his theme, the artwork defaced. Previously an object of prayers and vows, eukolais, Heracles has now been torn down, parariptomenon. And perhaps here we should also see in the statue's setting, in Triodoisin, verse 1, a reference to the famous story by Prodicus, told in Xenophon's Memorabilia 2:121-34, about Heracles at the crossroads, in which the hero had to choose between a difficult road to virtue and an easy path to vice. Now lying prone at the crossroads, Heracles can no longer serve as a model for that virtuous choice among Hellenes. Reacting with a formula that epic heroes use in deep vexation when addressing their own thumos to exhort themselves to action, okthesas dare epon, the speaker addresses the hero in terms that stress his divinity as one who wards off evil, alexikake, as the child begotten in the miraculous 3 nights lovemaking of Amphitryon and Alcmene, Triselene, and as a hero never defeated, medepot hete thes. But as though the power of the god is no longer present in his statue, now merely a fallen idol, Heracles is unable to reply, or simply does not reply. In the final couplet, however, the god, smiling, appears to the speaker in a dream. His words, like his smile, are mysterious. God though I am, I have learned to serve the times. That is, the kairos. Is this an admission of defeat or a survival strategy for a tumultuous age? Does his smile express resignation or a divinity's shrewd resistance? So far as I can see, no one has noted that Heracles' words here closely echo those that this same hero speaks near the end of his eponymous Euripidean tragedy. And I've put the verse just up there. I apologize that it's not on the handout. Compare the last verse of Palladius' epigram with this nun doseoike te tuche douleuteon, as opposed to kairo douleuen kai theos un emathon that we have in Palladius. Interestingly, In Euripides, these words come just as the title character has embraced his humanity, his mortal parentage through Amphitryon rather than through Zeus, and resolved to endure in life rather than to despair. This choice is accompanied by tears, the hero's first ever. In Palladas, by contrast, Heracles smiles and remains clearly and emphatically a god, both as described by the speaker, theos, in verse 5, and in his own words, theos on, verse 6. Perhaps then, like his Euripidean counterpart, he endures, but this time as a god, and his appearance in the dream possibly suggests that his power, like that of the Olympian gods in the epigram of Palladas examined previously, has migrated to a more remote location than at the crossroads in his statue. In this, he is the servant of the times, the kairos, which Palladas meaningfully substitutes for Euripides' Tyche. Despite the toppled statue, then, does Palladas view the god as down but not out? Be that as it may, Palladas, too, is a servant of the kairos, the particular moment he lived in, inasmuch as he adapted traditions of Ecphrasis to describe something new, a troubling phenomenon of his turbulent time, the disfigurement and transformation of divine statues. And as I'm also a servant of the kairos, I will stop here.